I got the grace. Life and every other thing that fall into place.
Hey beautiful, welcome to another video. I am so excited about this video. Like, this is one of those books that I feel like everyone should have the opportunity to read. So today's book review is Eye Bags and Dimples, an autobiography by Bonnie Henna. It is absolutely amazing. Now, if you want a little bit more info about this book, I do have a little bit more information about it in my in my Black Friday haul, where I talk about purchasing this book. It is absolutely amazing. For today, I'm not really going to review it, so let's not call this a book review. Let's call it more like an audio version. I'm just going to read through maybe 2 or 3 chapters for you guys, just to give you guys a good taste. And I really hope you guys will purchase this book. This is very, very powerful, especially when we're talking about mental health in the Black community. This is just extremely powerful. Okay, so chapter number 1, My Father's House. Okay. As any Black South African kid can tell you, religion is a constant, gigantic entity in their childhood. For Black people, going to church is an essential ingredient of every good person's makeup. Whatever debauchery they may indulge in during the week, as long as they do it discreetly, come Sunday, it's all water under the bridge as soon as they set foot in a church. I was no different in that regard. Like most children, I never really got the point of church, especially because some of the most unpleasant adults were the ones who frequented church the most. For me, it was a Sunday tradition in which I took part reluctantly, only because my mother thought it was a first-rate idea. My siblings and I were enrolled in the tradition by our mother, the way mothers enroll their kids in all kinds of activities. What I hated most about church was the 3-kilometer walk to get there every Sunday. My feet and shoes would get caked in dust, and the sight of them brought a lump to my throat and left me in a terrible mood. I hated dirt with every fiber in my body, but no matter how cleverly constructed my excuses were, nothing ever dampened my mother's determination to get us to church every Sunday. Our church was the Zoe Bible Church, which held its services in the hall of Tabajabula Secondary School in Klipspruit. The fact that church was held at a school may have influenced my dislike of it. Still, I didn't exactly hate it. Our charismatic pastor cut a dashing figure, especially in a suit, and I loved staring at his kids. They were so good looking, with their long hair, immaculate outfits, and perfect behavior. Perhaps I just assumed they were well behaved because they looked so good, or that they were good looking because they were the pastor's kids. If your father was a pastor, you surely had no desire to misbehave. Occasionally, I really focused on what the pastor was saying and sang from my heart. During some hymns, the congregation would break into choreographed sequences to match the words. If the lyrics said, "I walk with him and sit with him," the congregation would animatedly mimic walking and sitting. If I managed to not let my awkwardness get in the way, there was a kind of happiness about being at church, but mostly I dismissed all this as silly and unnecessary. A far cry from the composed and discreet behavior at Mass on Friday mornings at Belgravia Convent, where I attended school until Standard 4. I knew that the nuns would vehemently disapprove of these displays of emotions at church, yet once in a while I'd find myself enjoying some of the catchier tunes. People came in their Sunday best from all over Soweto to worship and listen to our pastor's engaging sermons, but the start of the sermon was the signal for us kids to go off to one of the classrooms for Sunday school. Our Sunday school teacher was very strict, and I never dared get into her bad books. But it wasn't difficult, as I was a quiet child. Sometimes I believed God approved of. We sat on orange chairs, each marked with the school's initials in peeling black paint behind the backrest. I didn't pay much attention. I simply sat there, and my biggest sin, when I thought no one was looking, was to flake the paint off, leaving tiny pieces of black under the fingernails after church. From the way the school property was vandalized, I could tell his pupils were neither fond of it nor disciplined, so peeling paint off the chairs wouldn't make much of a difference, I decided. Sometimes I wished that I could catch the spirit, an experience adults spoke of and seemed to long for, but which was granted only to the holiest of individuals. I figured it would set me apart and mean God was pleased with me. I didn't speak much as a child. I kept to myself, and I cringed if any sort of attention was pointed in my direction. I always felt foreign in my own body. I had an awkwardness, a discomfort with my appearance and movement, and my skinniness didn't help. The self-consciousness accompanied me wherever I went, mocking me the way boys on a street corner sniggered at the girls' legs as they passed. This feeling lurked deep and sometimes seeped through my composure to the surface. I can't recall the precise moment that I noticed it. It was there from the first moment I became aware of myself, as if I'd been born with it. It regulated my moods and behavior, dictating how far I could go, how much I could relax or laugh. My default position was always a subtle discomfort, an uncertainty lurking behind every activity I engaged in. And it was a feeling that something wasn't quite right about me and my way of doing things, that I didn't belong. Kids laughed at me all the time. I realize now that kids are often nasty and revel in the misfortune of others, and sometimes I too participated in mocking other kids. But at the time the problem seemed uniquely mine, as if I had a sign on my forehead saying, "Laugh at me." Walking home from the taxi stop after school, I got mocked for carrying a hockey stick, wearing a blazer, or going to a multiracial school. At school, I didn't fit in either. Everything about me seemed out of place. Kids laughed because my hair wasn't relaxed, because I brought the same lunch to school every day, or because I was thin, especially my legs. They called me stick matambo, stick bones. I took it all so seriously, and their words crushed me. Worst of all, at home, nothing I said, did, or achieved received any applause or even acknowledgement. If my mother commented at all, it was only to say, "You can do better." I so badly wanted to please her, to wipe away that look of disappointment on her face when she looked at me, but it seemed nothing I did ever could. I longed for the day when I'd give up trying to please her for good, though a part of me dreaded it. The result was a gaping hole inside me. It felt like no one had put much thought into my existence or purpose in this world. I was a poorly thought out plan, and now everyone just had to bear with me, though no one wanted me or took any account or care of me. Not my mother, not even God. God was a distant watcher guy, with our souls spread out on a big chessboard in front of him. He was moving the chess pieces around just for the sake of it, to see what might happen. I was just a chess piece being shoved meaninglessly about. I assumed that he wanted nothing to do with me, though I tried to neaten up or put on airs and graces when I prayed, as one did before those in authority. Still, I like Psalms 23 and John chapter 3 verse 16, maybe because our Sunday school teacher forced us to memorize them. In those passages, my watcher guy's profile sounded impressive, yet having given his only son to die on the cross made God sound lonely and misunderstood, almost vulnerable. He still willingly gave his most precious gift without knowing if it would be acknowledged or accepted. And how could he do all those amazing things in Psalm 23 and in John, yet still feel so distant? It was all too unimaginable. I couldn't relate to it at any level. Much like my mother, he must have been a pretty tough parent to please, and no other offering from his son except death on a cross would do. Such was my young and naive view. He was a good man back then, I thought, but the things disciple John said my watcher guy did clearly didn't relate to me in any practical way. He certainly wasn't willing to do them in my current situation, and anyway, his promises and miracles looked a bit too extravagant. Besides, God allowed way too many bad things to happen, and he did it knowingly. At Sunday school, they taught us that God knew everything before it happened, so he had known black people would be despised for their skin color, but still went ahead with it. Couldn't he have made them lighter or come up with a less complicated situation? This question bothered me particularly because I already despised any form of injustice. He could have made people's lives much easier. It would have been no skin off his back. This was just one of many doubts that cast a shadow for me over his supposedly good intentions. Chapter 2. My Mother's House. I was 5 when my mother became suicidal. From then on, the mood in our house was always somber, the ambience gloomy and void of all hope. I spent much of my time feeling sorry for my mother, wishing I could take upon myself all the pain she was carrying, to spare her from the harshness of the world. At first, only my siblings and I knew about her death wish. Over the years, she spoke of it increasingly as the solution to every problem. It became her life, her dream, her promise of paradise. She spoke of it longingly, with glazed eyes in the way Christians speak of heaven. It was as if death had become her truth, but her threats plunged me into desolation. The constant fear of losing her loomed over my head like a spectre, and she learned to wield it as a weapon to coerce us into cooperation. It took many, many years before I stopped listening to my mother. I stopped because it hurt too much. Because after years of threats, I realized that they were just a cry for help and an instrument of torture, whether intentional or not, that she waved in an attempt to force us to join her pity party. Mom hadn't always been like that. I remembered a time when my mother was happier. She would listen to music, sip red wine, cook exotic dishes and dress in stylish clothes. It was still just the two of us then. Each morning she would take me to creche before she left for work. I remember her waking me on a cold winter morning with a cup of sweet milky tea in her hand. She'd wrap a blanket around me like a pyramid, with my head peeping out at the top, and speak lovingly and patiently to me as she pottered around getting ready for work. If she went out of view, I'd call to her, "I'm still here, Nunu," she'd answer sweetly. Only when I was warm enough from the blanket would she dress me and walk me to creche. After creche, Gogo, my granny, would fetch me. On our way home, we'd detour past the house of a friend, Goga Girlie, whose name was no doubt conferred by a white madam for whom she worked as a domestic. Goga Girlie ran a delectable business from a little table covered with a carpet outside her house, selling amachepis, amaskopas, sugary orange sweets that melted in your mouth, and white marshmallows freckled with toasted coconut. Gogo Girlie was my favorite because she let me nibble on sweets while she gossiped with my granny. My grandmother was a tall, svelte woman with a graceful beauty, chiseled features and shoulder-length hair, rumored to be from Indian blood. She always seemed so caring and kind, but so fragile that it seemed a passing wind might sweep her away. She had spent her life doing domestic work for Jewish families in the east of Johannesburg, where she learned to cook Mediterranean style and passed this skill on to my mother. Not surprisingly, I still love Mediterranean food. I loved my granny and enjoyed our closeness. Gogo told good stories and never seemed to tire of my endless questions, which mostly started with, "Why?" We'd sit and fold laundry together, and she'd teach me how to iron or plait my hair, and sometimes tell me jokes, though there was often a cloud of sadness about her. But her relationship with my mother was not a peachy one. Gogo always seemed disappointed in my mother. Both she and my mother shared a detached, distant look that seemed characteristic of the Mbuli women. Whenever Mom was in the room, Gogo's face took on a grimace of disapproval. I never forgot that look, with her eyes all scrunched up in disdain. Soon my mother began to use that same look on me. I have a jarring memory of my mother coming home from work to find my grandmother ironing in the family room. Apparently, unprovoked, my grandmother began to hurl insults at her. Mom ignored her and continued to busy herself quietly around the house, but my granny didn't stop. Her voice grew louder and the insult uglier. Then suddenly she was attacking Mom with the hot iron. Mom tried to fend Gogo off and grab the iron out of her hand. I was terrified and crying, but paralyzed with fear and helplessness. My mother eventually managed to peel the iron handle out of Gogo's bony fingers. I was 5 when my grandmother passed away. She was only in her 50s. Her addiction to alcohol had finally closed the curtain on her life story. This addiction had so gripped her that she resorted to drinking methylated spirits when she ran out of money to buy alcohol. And she drank it neat. She must have been self-medicating, trying to deal with some unbearable emotional pain deep inside her. Although I loved my grandmother, I was at peace with her passing because she was such a tormented woman. A few months later, my brother was born, and soon Mom began speaking of suicide. Ahile was the most adorable baby, with cheeks so plump and soft I often imagined biting into them. I took care of him on weekends and school holidays, and I loved being with him, letting him fall asleep on my skinny little lap. His skin always glowed because in black homes a baby smeared with Vaseline was a loved baby. 5 years later, my sister Koketso was born, a perfect little bundle with smooth cocoa skin. She had such a calming effect on me, and still does. She too often fell asleep in my skinny arms. I took even greater care of her because by then I was 10, apparently ready for more responsibility. Being the firstborn made me responsible for everybody. I hated responsibility, more so because it was thrust on me like an inheritance. It meant I got beatings on everybody's behalf, even when they were the ones who'd misbehaved. And we all got more beatings than I care to recall. In our 4-room Soweto house in Pimville Zone 3, my time was spent doing chore after chore, including the cooking and looking after my siblings. My mother was at work during the day, and like many black moms, she had a fixation with cleanliness. I was expected to keep the house sparkling, and failure to do so resulted in a severe beating. My existence began to revolve around avoiding beatings. It became my greatest motivator. Our house was second from the corner, opposite the Blue Flame bottle store, a well-known landmark. It was part of a strip of shops that serviced a large part of the neighborhood. I always wondered why the bottle store was the largest of all the shops. There were many bottle stores in township, all well advertised. Later I came to realize that having so many bottle stores in the township was part of the grand sophisticated scheme of apartheid designed to choke the life out of black families. Of the 3 food shops, my favorite was the one that sold the best spikos or takeaway food. In our zone, the amagwinya, chips, white liver and snook fish were especially delicious. The other 2 shops sold staples like bread, milk, cold drink and general groceries. But my mom didn't like buying from them because they were pricier than the supermarkets in town, like the OK bazaars. So whenever she sent me to the shops, it was with a pained look on her face. But at times there just wasn't enough money to go around. Occasionally we went to bed without eating, and there'd be only enough bread for my lunchbox the next morning, with sandwich spread and a bit of margarine. The other kids' lunches always looked nicer than mine, so I was ashamed and ate it when no one was looking, or not at all. Fortunately, my brother's school supplied him with lunch. Mom became really sad at these times. "I'm pulling hard," she'd say. I hated hearing those words because it felt like we might not make it. One day, a lady from our church, Lindin Klapo, came by while we were eating bread and cabbage for lunch. A little later, she returned with a bag of groceries. I learned the power of kindness that day and never forgot that generous gesture. Mom carried a lot of responsibility and often lamented being a single parent as she did chores around the house. She was resourceful and creative with the little she had. She had a cottage at the back of the house and transformed the garage beside it into another cottage. We called them the back rooms and rented them out to other families. We often grew close to our tenants, and if they had children, I played with them. Ngwana and Ida were the couple who rented from us the longest, and I loved Ngwana. He had a great sense of humor and was always telling jokes. Sometimes he bought me sweets and tickled me as I tried to reach for them, and sometimes I daydreamed that he was my father and played out imaginary scenes of us doing father and daughter stuff together. In these scenes, I was always laughing. But then Mom had a fallout with Ngwana. I was heartbroken when he and Ida moved out. I had few friends, and at that time, Ahile was still too young to play with me. Mom tried to keep me as untouched by my environment as possible, and I was never allowed to play beyond our backyard. If I took too long at the shops, I got yelled at and interrogated. She drummed into my head that no one was to be trusted. People were mean, jealous, and only wished us the worst. Like most families, she also feared witchcraft and spoke of how easily one could get bewitched in Soweto. Women gossiped endlessly about the latest victim and the suspected sorcerer, and I found these conversations fascinating. I longed to be connected to the vast and unknown world out there, but Mom built a strong case against it, so I grew scared of it. Heeding her advice, I became cautious, impenetrable. There was much to be feared out there. It was the only explanation for Mom's paranoia. Stuck at home and bored out of my mind, I would lie on my back on the grass, staring at random cloud formations and making out shapes of animals and objects. Sometimes I imagined that the sky was sending me private messages. I also took to writing stories and reading anything I could find. But I still hated being alone. My loneliness was a constant ache in my heart. All I wanted was to be worthy enough to have someone to talk to play with me and care for me, just like other children. But it was a losing battle. "Mama," I'd plead, "I don't like being home alone all the time. I get scared and bored." "Don't be ridiculous. I have to work. You expect me to stay home and stare into your eyes all day long?" After my brother was born, Mom hired a babysitter to stay with us. But the babysitter often covered me with a blanket and beat me with a belt while I cried beneath the layer of wool. I tried my best to keep this from Mom because I preferred the beatings to the loneliness. But Mom finally found out and fired her. When Ngwana moved out of the back room, a new family moved in with a daughter about 3 years older than me, and we began to play together. Jabulile was a strong, stout girl with a big protruding bottom and bullyish personality. One day while Mom was at work, she told me to lie down so she could show me something. Then she forced herself onto me, rubbing herself against my pelvis till she moaned and groaned and let out a long sigh of relief. I lay there frozen, in shock, afraid to move or say anything. From then on, I was afraid of Jabulile, and I was relieved when they moved out of our back room. But for years afterwards, I was tormented with feelings of shame, helplessness, and self-loathing. I became convinced that I deserved what she'd done. I hadn't objected, so I must have wanted it. What other explanation could there be? Whenever Mom beat me hard and called me isfebe, whore, for losing my school blazer or forgetting to wash the dishes, things that didn't warrant such a label, I assumed she saw something in me that called for it. 2 houses from ours lived a girl called Buleng, with whom I was strictly forbidden to play. Mom said she was fast. If I ever see you with her, I'll give you a hiding. But when my mother wasn't home, Buleng often rounded up a couple of kids, including boys, to come and play in my yard. Mom wasn't wrong about Buleng. She always wanted to play grown-up games, and she knew a lot about what grown-ups did behind closed doors. We'd play Umantrani, house, and Buleng would always insist on being the mother and picking the oldest boy to play the father. She had a strong personality and narrated as we played. It's night time now and all the kids must go to play, she announced. Mother and father are in their bedroom. We'd all pretend to sleep while Buleng took the arm of the father and forced it onto her waist or even her bottom. She was so daring and knew so much about the world that we all worshipped her and believed whatever she told us without question. Mom's threats could never dampen my enthusiasm for Buleng's company. Sometimes Buleng would come over, would peer out from beneath the lounge curtains, shouting silly insults through the open window at other children passing on their way to the shops. Would base our insults on how they looked or dressed, like Chiskop, bald head, Umubi, ugly, or Shangan, or Ya Papa, no it all. And would just shout, Futek, go away. This is hilarious. This is what kids do. This is so hilarious. The insults had to be brief enough for us to drop out of sight before the scorned individual saw us. The objective was to make the insults nameless and faceless, as if they'd appeared out of nowhere. Buleng and I would laugh till our stomachs ached, and our giggling fits often meant that the next insult we tried to hurl got choked among stifled giggles. One day we took the teasing too far. Buleng suggested that we Zula wander around a bit. We wandered beyond Zone 3 till we reached Tiskanga, open field in Zone 4, the one I used to have to walk through to creche years before. The field was still just rough gravel, but no longer so barren. Now it had a jungle gym and a Michichirizo slide. While we were very happily playing on the Michichirizo, an older boy appeared and began playing at the far end of the field. He also looked like he'd unexpectedly discovered this makeshift playground. Then Buleng whispered in my ear. Her plan was to watch from the ground until the boy got to the highest point of the jungle gym, then shout, "Hey wena, Jolinkomo," and make a run for it. I asked her what Jolinkomo meant. "Don't be stupid, man, I just made it up," she said dismissively. I thought her insult sounded ingenious. A concoction alluding to a relationship with a cow. We were giggling so hard we had to recover before we had the energy to shout loud enough for the boy to hear. The first time we shouted loud and clear, he glanced over and chose to ignore us. We tried once more, and then again. On our 4th try, his eyes suddenly zoomed in on us like a bull, seeing red, and then he came for us. "Baleka, run!" We ran like our lives depend on it, in torrents of laughter charged with the adrenaline that was now pounding through our chests and veins. Luckily, Buleng and I were both good runners. Having bagged a head start by timing the attack when he was at the top of the jungle gym, we managed to outrun him. Once we were quite certain we'd lost him, we stopped to catch our breath, doubled over with our hands on our knees for support. We soon forgot all about the incident, but unknown to us, the boy just happened to live on our very same street. Only 1 block to the right, and one evening, with the sun setting in a dusky yellow and pink sky, and the crickets already singing the lament, Mom sent me off to the shop. I saw him just as I was about to turn the corner and cross over, and he was coming straight at me. Fear crackled through my body like electricity. "B, anyigo tolanga." "Got you," he shouted, his hand raised as if to slap me. "I told you I'd get you." "Hi, askimi." "It wasn't me," I squealed. My voice was cracking in terror. "Bekungani wami uBuleng." It was my friend Buleng. The fiery sting on my face was so sudden and so loud that my vision blurred and I staggered, nearly losing my balance. Through hot tears, I watched him walk away, turning one last time to wag a finger at me. "Uzoyeka ukujwayela kabi. That'll teach you for disrespecting me." I arrived home crying inconsolably, his fingers clearly imprinted across my swollen cheek. My mother extracted the whole story from me and promised me a vicious beating if I ever dared to play with Buleng again. And I never did, although I missed her companionship sorely. Chapter 3. After school is after school. Soweto was a tough place. Its malnourished scenery was a far cry from the opulent suburban world I traveled through on my way to school. Compared to the lush white suburbs, it was barren, grim, and uninspiring. There was no street names, pavements, parks, or anything that beckoned to the soul. No beauty inspired one to do or become more, and this was no coincidence. It was part of the plan. The only beauty lived in the hearts of its people and in the meticulous cleanliness of their gardens and homes. The women rose early to sweep their yards each morning and shine their stoops in bright red polish, a testament to their resilience and determination to live with dignity and pride. I was blessed to receive a top education while growing up. We all sacrificed a lot for this. My mother especially made great sacrifices to afford me this privilege. Almost everything she had went towards ensuring that we got the finest education available. For this decision, she faced great criticism and chastisement from friends, relatives, and neighbors. They regularly commented that she was living beyond her means to try to outdo everyone else. Why not just enroll her kids at the Bantu schools in the township like others did? But my mother's courage was never wavered. She kept her sights on the bigger picture and persevered, depriving herself of everyday comforts and relaxation time to make it happen. Perhaps people weren't so much angry at her for it, as if afraid to do the same. Who were they, in a country like ours, to want a better education for their kids? Like most black people, they knew their place, but not my mother. She was a strong-willed woman who lived to defy the word impossible. If she was told she couldn't do something or that it had never been done before, that was her cue to go right ahead and do it. And I inherited that brazen, pioneering, nonconformist spirit of hers. Because of her, I loathe the sight of fear. I strive tirelessly to eradicate it from my life, to face it head-on and never let it control me. In 1984, South African schools were segregated, and most black children were forced to make do with an inferior and deprived form of education. Yet I, at the age of 5, was sent to a private school, the Dominican Convent School in Belgravia in eastern Johannesburg. At first, I was one of the only 2 black children at the school, and in most of the classes, mine was the only black face. This wasn't something that stood out for me at the time, although it had a powerful impact on my socialization. This was a traditional Catholic school with a strong religious foundation. The convent rules were stringent, and we weren't allowed to run or even raise our voices in the corridors. Displays of strong emotion were simply not proper. A model student was always composed. Mass was compulsory every Friday morning at 8 o'clock in a quaint, beautiful chapel with elegant stained glass windows and the comforting smell of incense. The nuns were our school teachers, and we had confession every Wednesday afternoon, followed by our penance. The specifics of our penance depend on the weight of our sins, which usually consisted of pinching a pencil, talking in class, or lying about unfinished homework. We might have to say 10 Hail Marys and then mess around outside while we waited for others to finish confessing their multitude of sins. It amazed me that our father had the patience to sit through the same bland confessions week after week. I honestly never knew what to confess in there. It was some of my most earnest waffling about nothing. Attending this school meant that most of my friends were white, but in the midst of apartheid, our friendships were solid and entirely uncontaminated by racial prejudice, apart from the occasional comment from the nuns intended to put black students in their place. Stop behaving like savages. We don't speak black languages in this school. This is not the township. My school life created a stark contrast to my home life in the townships, an often hostile terrain plagued by rioting, random tear gas attacks, and stayaways during the last thrashing and kicking of the dying horse of apartheid. Sometimes the security forces would undertake slow, menacing drive-bys through the township in their armored vehicles, which were called hippos. Perched arrogantly on the top of those hippos, they would give us kids their most hostile looks and would stop whatever we're busy with to stare back in defiance. It was a regular drill intended to intimidate us into acceptance and to keep the yoke of oppression firmly in its place. For years I wrestled with a silent, gnawing sense that South Africa didn't quite belong to me. It felt like a quiet displacement intended to bully me out of my birthplace and inheritance. We endured several scary nights with 2 or 3 armed security men barged noisily into our house around 2 in the morning. Would wake up with the biggest fright, my mother and I, while they searched our house, speaking loudly to each other in Afrikaans and scrolling through our homes as if they owned it, searching for anything and everything, rummaging through our stuff and turning our things upside down. These midnight raids left us feeling violated and helpless. So grave was the assault on our dignity and privacy. Afterwards, it became impossible not to associate the Afrikaans language with aggression and hostility. Twice, while I was at the shops for my mother, a cloud of tear gas was randomly released into the air, making it impossible to see. Instantly, the whole area around the shops became a scurry of confusion as we all, mostly children, scattered like ants before a hosepipe. Tear gas stings the eyes like a chopped onion, but 10 times stronger, burning its way up the nostrils and disorientating the mind. I didn't recognize at the time how the years of trauma visited on my community jabbed at my self-worth and my sense of collective identity. My will was strong, but in deep secluded corners I carried the shame of being labeled an inferior. Because of this, I nurtured an unacknowledged hatred of South Africa and all that it represented. And perhaps some of this feeling still lingers. Many adults, including my mom, would warn us children of how evil and dark the hearts of white people were, how they hated black people and would stop at nothing to see the black nation destroyed. Whites were heartless and not to be trusted, yet my white school friends were nothing like that. We loved each other, we talked, cried, hugged and laughed together, stood shoulder to shoulder, singing our school song in solidarity. The chasm between my school life and my home life was vast, and I often found myself lost in the divide between them. One day my mother came home driving a bright yellow Opel Kadett. It was a landmark in our lives. Our neighbors oohed and ahed and had a whole lot more to say behind our backs. Here was my mother, a single black woman in her 30s in apartheid South Africa, who owned her own house as well as a car. This was so rare as to be totally audacious, but she'd always longed for a car and had first enrolled herself in a driving school to learn to drive. Now that she'd accepted a second job that required working late at night, she really needed one. Growing up with such a mother made me into a daring adult too, accustomed to taking risks and going where most in my world wouldn't dare. But back then, I simply enjoyed sitting in the back seat of the car as we cruised and sticking my tongue out or scrunching my nose at the kids playing hopscotch or mugusha, rope skipping, in the streets, giggling because they could do nothing about it. But I had to sit very close to the window and dodge my mother's eyes in the mirror, because if she caught me, I'd get her hiding. Soon after my baby sister was born, we rented out our old house and moved to a new development 3 kilometers away in Soweto. The new house was brand new and much bigger. It didn't have much furniture, but it was full of promise. It had clean carpets, 3 bedrooms, a lounge, dining area and a kitchen, plus indoor bathrooms for the first time in our lives. 2 of them. Both my mother's jobs were at the University of Witwatersrand, a day job in the Student Affairs Department and an evening job till 11 o'clock on the switchboard at Jubilee, the women's residence. Before my sister was born, when we were scared to stay home alone while she worked a night, she took us to work with her. We'd sit on the floor of her booth, drawing and reading, staring at the maze of switches that she handled like a pro, which thoroughly impressed me. At her work, I thought my mother was a superhero. She was smart, stylish, and always smelled of potpourri, a timeless, elegant, and fearless woman. I admired her greatly and could sit and watch her for hours. She'd joke with and chat to the girls as they strolled in and out of the residence, or scold them for being out late and trying to sneak boys into their rooms. I loved the smile that lit her face and creased the corners of her eyes at those times. After she scolded the girls or the boys who came looking for them, she would lecture me about how a girl should behave. Yet all her lectures boiled down to a simple instruction: don't come home pregnant. It was the only sex education she ever gave me. She'd go on and on about how these girls' parents paid so much for them to attend this prestigious university, and she knew because she fielded calls from parents and students at the Student Affairs Department, some of whom poured their hearts out about their financial burdens. Don't think for one second that I'm going to pay all that money for you to go and run around with boys like they do, she'd rant. But Mom, I haven't done anything. I'm not even at high school. Well, don't you dare even think about it. It seemed to her that I was already guilty. The best thing about Jubilee, or Jubes as it was affectionately called, was the supper. The dining hall wasn't far from Mom's desk, and the smells would waft enticingly past my nose. Along with the students, Mom was allowed to get supper in the dining hall, and my favorite treat was the pizza. I found the students endless moaning about the food extremely ungrateful as I tucked ravenously into my pizza slice while the oil from the cheese dripped down my forearm. Over time, Mom's demeanor steadily deteriorated. With hindsight, I'm certain she suffered from postnatal depression after the births of both my brother and sister. The atmosphere in our house followed Mom's mood, and a slab of impenetrable doom hung in the air. Whenever mom decided to hibernate in her bedroom and sit life out, I became responsible for running the household, making sure the kids were eating and the house was cleaned. My schoolwork began to suffer and I stopped caring. The weight of my family was like a wet blanket draped over me, smothering the light inside. School went by in a daze. I hardly paid attention. I was overwhelmingly stressed. The anxiety, loneliness and awkwardness slowly gained on me like thick black oil seeping into every cavity. I saw no point in trying. There was no hope for my life. From standard 3 onward, along with the increasing pressure at home, I became disruptive in class. I was restless, anxious and began constantly acting out, doing things that landed me in detention. I was frustrated and stressed and never wanted to be at home. I hated my life, didn't trust adults and had no faith in authority. So I rebelled against every rule I was expected to obey. The following year, mom was called in by one of our teachers. She said that my marks and behavior at school pointed to a deeper problem and suggested my mother take me to a psychologist. My mom took the words personally. She felt the school was taking a jab at her parenting skills and chose to ignore their advice. So I left Belgravia Convent on a sour note, and instead of getting help, I was sent to a Marist Brothers where I completed standard 5. I passed well and seemed to calm down, although my maths teacher was a neurotic Scottish woman who treated school like a boot camp. I hated maths and often became so overwhelmed that I would weep quietly with my head bent over my desk. With the arrival of my brother and later my sister, not only mom's mood but also her finances took strain, and Marist Brothers soon became unaffordable. So at the end of standard 5, I switched schools again. Greenside High was one of the new Model C schools, government schools that were now allowed to accept black kids. I was part of the first intake of black children. The culture at Greenside was very white, with a sprinkling of Afrikaans. Some of the kids were outright hostile to black people and proud of it, but most were simply indifferent. For someone like me who'd been schooled with white kids from the start, I found this annoying and childish. But I didn't take it personally as other kids did, because I knew enough white people who weren't like that, so I knew it had nothing to do with me. I could live with people disliking me because of my skin color, but what angered me was their sense of entitlement to vomit their racism into my space. It was really difficult to fit in with the black girls I met at school. I wasn't versed in the latest street lingo and mannerisms. I wasn't cool enough, so I found myself gravitating towards the white girls who were more accepting. The black kids called me a snob and a coconut and mocked everything about me. Understandably, the differences between us were significant. Not only had we been schooled in very different social environments, but I was already awkward and aloof and used to being outside of a group fold. My two best friends, Katie and Sasha, were white. I got invited to all the white kids' parties and my taste in music leaned more towards rock and alternative, while most of my black peers listened to township pop and rhythm and blues. I'd attended ballet classes for most of my primary school life, so I walked with perfect posture, my back straight and my feet turned out like a duck. I played hockey instead of netball. For a long time I was the only black girl who played hockey, and I apparently spoke like a white. Yeah, I was different, and I took a lot of flack for it. That was the least of my problems, so I never fought to fit in or to be accepted by them. Whenever the black kids used their smug, street smart ways against me, I retaliated using my intellect and knowledge, talking circles around them. This became my weapon. The social side of school was a constant struggle. The lines between the different groups were clearly drawn, and you always had to be careful not to step on any toes. Somehow, with my compulsion to speak up against lawlessness, disorder and injustice, I always managed to put my foot in it. In one incident, a commotion erupted because a classmate's bra had been stolen from the change rooms during physical education. It wasn't just any bra. It was Christie's French lace La Perla bra that she'd brought back overseas trip, and we'd all been allowed to peek down her shirt the first day she wore it. Now everybody was gathered around as she wept hysterically. Christie was sweet and kind and had never done anything to antagonize me. So soon afterwards, when I spotted the lacy pattern of her bra under Lorato's shirt, I felt duty-bound to tell Christie. Lorato was a crass, mean girl with a vast knowledge of boys and how to entice them, which she liked to share at the top of her voice on the 74 bus. She was the ringleader of a group, and everyone jumped at her instruction. When Christie confronted her, Lorato gave an Oscar performance, declaring that Christie was arrogant to assume she couldn't afford a fancy bra, and pulled the "it's because I'm black" card. During the altercation, it came out that I was the one who told Christie. To say that I was neck deep in horse manure would be an understatement. By second break, news had spread that Lorato wanted my head on a platter, and everybody was scared for me, including me. People were wagging their fingers at me in the corridors saying, aye, after school is after school. I knew well I couldn't win a fight against Lerato and didn't want to get embroiled into her street fighting ways, but I was terrified. So with Christy at my side, I reported her to my teacher, and to my enormous surprise and relief, Lerato left me alone after school. She evidently knew she was beaten. Greenside High was a far rougher place than my primary school had ever been. It was survival of the fittest, so you had to belong somewhere. If you were a stray, you were a target for ridicule, like a bleeding antelope before a pride of lions. But my friendships at school kept me going. I spent many weekends at Katie's house in Northcliffe, a welcome break from the heavy responsibilities I carried at home. Whenever those weekends came to an end and I had to go home, I would weep inconsolably. So this is Eye Bags and Dimples by Bonnie Henna. This is an incredible read. Anybody who has purchased this has really great things to say. I wish I could read the whole book for you guys because it just gets even more juicy and super interesting. So I hope you guys enjoyed today's review, today's audio version of a book. I will have the link for this book in the description box. I got mine from Take A Lot. I hope you guys enjoyed today's video, and I'll see you guys in my next video. Bye.